Friends, thank you for being here today. What if I told you that the ultimate kill switch to the American empire isn't hidden in a bunker in Moscow, a server farm in Beijing, or a nuclear silo in Pyongyang, but is quietly resting just across the longest, most unguarded border on the planet? How is it possible that the loudest, most aggressively dominant superpower in human history is completely blind to the silent giant holding its leash? We need to talk about the grand illusion of the American empire, particularly the version of it being aggressively sold to us by politicians in Washington today. If you listen to the current rhetoric, especially the America First doctrine pushed by Donald Trump and his loyalists, you hear a singular, unyielding narrative. It's a narrative of absolute, unquestionable American supremacy. It's a worldview where the United States dictates the terms of reality, where allies are treated like subordinate employees, and where the northern neighbor is viewed as little more than a polite, snowy vassal state that exists merely to absorb American culture and comply with American demands. We see the threats of tariffs casually thrown around like poker chips. We see the constant demands for compliance. We see a political theater designed to make the American public believe that the United States is an impenetrable fortress that relies on absolutely no one. But what if the loudest guy in the room is actually completely at the mercy of the quietest? Let's pull back the curtain on a geopolitical reality that Washington desperately hopes you never figure out. Because geography, my friends, does not care about the size of a military budget. Geography does not care about the ego of a sitting president, the roar of a campaign rally, or the bravado of a late-night social media post. Politicians in D.C. love to boast. They love to point out that the United States has a population nearly 10 times the size of Canada's. They love to flex a military budget that is exponentially larger, armed with the most advanced weaponry the human race has ever engineered. On paper, it looks like a staggering mismatch. It looks like the classic tale of the big brother protecting and occasionally bullying the little brother. But paper doesn't reflect the unforgiving terrain of the earth. The truth is, Canada is sitting on distinct, unbreachable geographic chokeholds, vital, undeniable pillars of American survival. If pushed to the absolute brink by reckless, hostile, and short-sighted American policies, Canada doesn't need to roll out tanks. They don't need to launch a single missile. They don't need to fire a single shot to bring the United States economy to a devastating, grinding halt. They just need to close their hands. Before we anatomize these geographic weapons, I want to hear from you. Do you think politicians in Washington are actually blind to these vulnerabilities, or are they just playing a highly dangerous game of bluff? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, and let's get into it. Let's start with the most primal, non-negotiable resource for human survival and industrial supremacy: water. When we talk about global conflict, our minds instinctively go to oil, uranium, or microchips. But intelligence agencies and forward-thinking strategists have known for decades that the wars of the late 21st century will not be fought over fossil fuels. They will be fought over fresh water. And in this arena, Canada is an undisputed, untouchable superpower. Here is the hard, indisputable fact. Canada controls roughly 20% of the world's surface fresh water. Let that sink in. 1/5 of the most critical resource on the planet is located within the borders of a single nation. But it's not just about the sheer volume. It's about where that water flows and who desperately depends on it. Look at the Great Lakes system. To the untrained eye, it's just a massive body of water shared by two friendly nations. But from a strategic standpoint, it is the exposed jugular vein of the American industrial heartland. Over 40 million people rely on the Great Lakes Basin for their drinking water. This isn't just rural farmland. We are talking about the sprawling metropolises that built the American century: Chicago, Detroit, Cleveland, Buffalo. The very cities that manufacture American wealth, assemble its vehicles, and process its resources are entirely tethered to a water system that intricately, unavoidably weaves through sovereign Canadian territory. Consider the St. Lawrence Seaway, the vital maritime artery that connects the Great Lakes to the Atlantic Ocean. Consider the Niagara River and the Detroit River. This water does not belong exclusively to the United States. It is a shared, deeply interconnected hydrological web. Now let's frame the geopolitical nightmare that keeps rational military planners awake at night, the planners who look past the political bluster. America cannot secure this border. The U.S.-Canada border is over 5,500 miles long. It is the longest international border in the world between two countries. It traverses rugged mountain ranges, dense, unnavigable boreal forests, the Great Plains, and the freezing expanses of the Arctic. You cannot build a wall across it. You cannot practically militarize it, and you certainly cannot invade and occupy a wilderness that vast and unforgiving. The logistics alone would bankrupt the Pentagon. So let's introduce a what-if scenario. What if the aggressive, America-first isolationism of a hostile U.S. administration forced Ottawa's hand? What if Washington decided to weaponize trade to such an extreme, vindictive degree that it threatened the core of the Canadian economy? Ottawa holds the ultimate leverage over the lifeblood of the American Midwest. While the idea of Canada damming rivers or aggressively diverting fresh water away from American cities sounds like the plot of a dystopian novel, the mere capacity to do so is the point. The fact that the U.S. Midwest exists at the hydrological mercy of its northern neighbor is a stunning reality. It is a display of incredible, almost unimaginable Canadian restraint that this geographical leverage is never weaponized, never flaunted, and rarely even mentioned, despite constant, humiliating trade bullying from their southern neighbor. Washington acts like it holds all the cards, completely ignoring the fact that Ottawa is standing next to the main water valve. But that liquid chokehold is only the beginning. If water is the biological lifeblood of the American empire, energy is its central nervous system, and the vulnerability here is even more immediate and, frankly, more terrifying. For years, American politicians have stood at podiums, pounding their fists, promising American energy independence. It's a great applause line. It looks fantastic on a bumper sticker. It's also a massive, carefully constructed myth. Let's look at the hard facts of the oil addiction. Despite the fracking boom and the endless drilling in Texas and North Dakota, America's energy infrastructure is fundamentally addicted to Canadian crude. Canada is, by a massive margin, America's largest foreign oil supplier. Every single day, around 4 million barrels of oil flow south across the border. This isn't loaded onto vulnerable tankers crossing oceans. It flows directly into the American industrial machine through an intricate, highly concentrated network of pipelines, most notably the Enbridge pipeline system. These energy veins pump the heavy crude from Alberta directly into the refineries of the American Midwest and the Gulf Coast. What happens if Canada decides it's had enough of arbitrary tariffs and political grandstanding? If Canada were to shut off the tap or simply redirect that flow, the consequences for the American economy wouldn't be measured in months or years. They would be measured in hours. Gas prices in the U.S. would double, perhaps triple, almost instantly. Supply chains would freeze. The economy would suffer a cardiac arrest. And because of the integrated nature of North American refineries, the U.S. couldn't just magically replace that specific type of heavy crude overnight. But oil is old news. The true terror lies in the electrical grid. This brings us to a concept that requires us to step carefully. In recent years, a terrifying scenario has been circulating in deep web geopolitical forums, elite intelligence circles, and leaked think tank war games. It's colloquially known among niche strategists as the 20% blackout theory. Before we proceed, we must separate verified public data from elite, speculative wargaming. According to these unverified simulations and shadow scenarios, some strategists whisper that Canada possesses the theoretical capability to cripple up to 20% of the U.S. power grid, specifically in the highly populated, economically crucial Northeast Corridor, simply by shutting down localized hydroelectric feeds from Quebec and British Columbia. The theory suggests that due to the cascading, fragile nature of the American electrical grid, severing these specific high-voltage geographic choke points wouldn't just turn off the lights in a few border towns. It would trigger a catastrophic domino effect across multiple states. Now let's look at the reality check. If you look at official Department of Energy reports, they will assure you that Canada supplies a relatively small fraction of the total national U.S. electricity consumption, hovering somewhere around 1 to 2% nationally. So why does the 20% blackout theory exist? Why is it whispered about in the halls of defense colleges? Because while the national percentage is low, the regional dependency is intensely critical. The U.S. Northeast, home to New York, Boston, and the financial engines of the world, is highly dependent on clean, reliable hydroelectric power flowing down from Canadian megadams. The viral nature of this theory exposes a very real, very raw American anxiety. The U.S. grid is notoriously outdated, fragile, and segmented. The fact that U.S. military and energy planners even have to stress over this doomsday switch, the fact that they have to run simulations on what happens if Hydro-Quebec suddenly cuts the cord, proves who actually holds the leverage. The United States operates under the assumption that Canada will always be the reliable battery pack to the north. But if Washington continues to treat its most vital energy partner like an adversary, how long until the battery pack decides to unplug? If this is the kind of unfiltered, deep-dive geopolitical reality check you've been looking for, make sure you hit that subscribe button right now. We dissect the shadow mechanics of global power every single week on this channel, and you definitely won't want to miss what we're uncovering next. But there is another layer to this survival equation. We've talked about the water you drink and the energy that keeps your lights on. Now, let's talk about the food on your table. Because before we even reach the frozen battlefield of the Arctic, there is a quiet, subterranean chokehold buried deep beneath the Canadian prairies that Washington desperately ignores. When politicians in D.C. boast about American might, they frequently point to the Midwest, the great American breadbasket. They paint this romanticized picture of the self-sustaining American farmer single-handedly feeding the nation and half the globe. It is a cornerstone of the America First mythology, the idea that the United States is agriculturally invincible. But modern, industrial-scale agriculture doesn't run purely on American grit and rainwater. It is a highly engineered biological machine, and that machine requires fuel. It requires fertilizer. Specifically, it requires a critical mineral compound known as potash, the absolute lifeblood of global crop yields. And who controls the undisputed lion's share of this critical resource? You guessed it. Just north of the North Dakota border, under the flat, unassuming plains of Saskatchewan, lies the largest, highest-grade deposit of potash on the planet. Canada is the Saudi Arabia of agricultural fertilizer. They are the global heavyweights, producing and exporting more of this essential mineral than any other nation on Earth. Here is the terrifying reality for the invincible American agricultural sector. The United States imports the overwhelming majority of the potash it uses, and the vast bulk of that comes directly from Canada. Every ear of corn in Iowa, every stalk of wheat in Kansas, every soybean field that sustains the American export economy is biologically dependent on minerals dug out of the Canadian dirt. So what happens if Washington's aggressive tariff wars and political brinkmanship push Ottawa too far? What if Canada decides to leverage this subterranean monopoly? This isn't a weapon that causes an overnight explosion like a grid blackout. It is a weapon of slow, agonizing economic suffocation. If Canada were to drastically restrict or embargo potash exports to the United States in retaliation for hostile trade policies, the American breadbasket would face a catastrophic crisis. Within a single growing season, crop yields would plummet. The soil would begin to exhaust itself. The sheer volume of food produced in the United States would crash, and the cost of whatever did grow would skyrocket to levels that would make recent inflation look like a joke. You want to see civil unrest in the United States? You don't need a foreign army to invade. You just need to triple the price of basic groceries at the supermarket. By controlling the fundamental building blocks of soil fertility, Canada essentially holds a remote control to American food security. And just like the Great Lakes and just like the Northern Power Grid, the United States has absolutely no immediate alternative. You cannot manufacture potash in a Silicon Valley laboratory. You cannot print it at the Federal Reserve. You either have it in the ground or you don't. America doesn't have enough. Canada has a practically infinite supply. It is the perfect invisible weapon. It operates entirely below the radar of cable news pundits who are too busy arguing about border walls and military budgets. Washington struts around the world stage, bragging about feeding the globe, utterly oblivious to the fact that they are standing on infertile ground, relying on the quiet neighbor to hand them the very nutrients that keep their empire alive. That brings us to the final and most forward-looking geographic reality. If water, energy, and food are the battlegrounds of today, the Arctic is the ultimate endgame of tomorrow. And it is here that the arrogance of Washington's current political trajectory reaches its most self-destructive climax. Let's rewind a few years. Remember when Donald Trump floated the idea of the United States purchasing Greenland from Denmark? The media mocked it. Pundits laughed it off as the erratic real estate obsession of a former reality TV star. But behind the scenes, military strategists weren't laughing. Because the Greenland obsession wasn't about golf courses. It was born out of a deep, existential panic within the Pentagon. Washington is terrified of losing the Arctic, and right now they are losing it badly. As climate change accelerates and the polar ice caps melt, the top of the world is rapidly transforming from an impassable frozen wasteland into the most valuable geopolitical real estate on Earth. We are talking about the opening of the Northwest Passage, a fabled maritime route that drastically cuts shipping times between Asia and Europe. Whoever controls this passage controls the trade arteries of the 21st century. And who owns the front door, the hallways, and the living room of the Northwest Passage? Canada. But it's not just about shipping lanes. The Arctic is a treasure trove of unimaginable proportions. Geological surveys estimate that the Arctic region holds roughly 13% of the world's undiscovered oil and a staggering 30% of its undiscovered natural gas. Furthermore, the future of human technology isn't powered by fossil fuels, it's powered by critical minerals. We are talking about the rare earth elements required for advanced military tech, the lithium for global battery dominance, the cobalt, the nickel. Canada sits on a massive, highly concentrated reserve of these critical minerals, hidden deep within the impenetrable fortress of the Canadian Shield and the remote Northern Territories. This is the mineral monopoly that will define the next 100 years of global supremacy. And America is completely reliant on external sources for it. This brings us to the ultimate geopolitical pivot, the moment where Washington's aggressive arrogance becomes its fatal downfall. By aggressively threatening Canada with tariffs, by insulting its leadership, by tearing up trade agreements and demanding one-sided concessions, the United States is practically forcing Ottawa to look for other friends. You cannot treat your most strategic, resource-rich neighbor like a punching bag and expect them to remain eternally loyal. Enter the China connection. This isn't a future possibility, it is a present reality. China is already Canada's second-largest trading partner. While Washington has spent years screaming at Ottawa, Beijing has been quietly, methodically writing checks. Chinese state-backed enterprises and investment firms are pouring billions of dollars into Canadian mining operations. They are securing the rights to the lithium, the cobalt, and the rare earth metals that the U.S. desperately needs to maintain its technological edge. China understands what Washington's current populist leaders are too blinded by ego to see: geography is destiny. If the United States makes itself an unreliable, hostile, and toxic partner, Canada has the geographic and economic means to simply pivot. They don't have to sell their oil to Texas. They don't have to sell their critical minerals to Silicon Valley. As the Arctic ice clears, Canada is developing the infrastructure to bypass America entirely, shipping its immense resources directly across the polar routes to an insatiable waiting market in Asia. Imagine a scenario where the U.S. tech sector and the U.S. military-industrial complex are suddenly starved of critical minerals because Canada, alienated by years of American abuse, has locked into exclusive, long-term supply contracts with Beijing. This is the nightmare scenario. America pushes Canada away, and in doing so, hands the keys to 21st century dominance directly to its greatest global rival. So, when we put all of this together, the entire dynamic flips. Let's step back and look at the chessboard as it truly is, not as the politicians in Washington want you to believe it is. The reality we are looking at is defined by those unshakable pillars we just discussed. There's the reality that the American industrial heartland survives at the hydrological mercy of Canadian waterways. There's the undeniable fact that the U.S. economy would collapse without Canadian crude, alongside the fragile vulnerability of the northern grid to Canadian hydroelectric power. There is the terrifying reliance on Canadian soil nutrients to keep the American breadbasket from starving. And finally, there's the unfolding reality that Canada controls the shipping lanes, the critical minerals, and the future wealth of the North, with the very real capability to pivot to China if America becomes too hostile to tolerate. Look at the contrast in how these two nations project power. Washington, specifically under aggressive, populist America First doctrines, operates like a sledgehammer. It relies on noise, on public threats, on short-term bullying, and on the illusion of absolute independence. It is a foreign policy driven by ego, designed for the next election cycle, completely ignorant of long-term geographic realities. Canada, on the other hand, operates like water. It is patient, it is restrained. It endures the insults and the noise with a quiet, steely resolve because it understands the permanent, unyielding power of geography. They know they hold the cards. They know they don't have to brag about it on social media. The illusion of the American empire is maintained only by the polite cooperation of the silent giant to the north. The guy holding the megaphone is standing squarely on a trapdoor, and the polite, quiet neighbor up north is the one with their hand resting firmly on the lever. If this video changed the way you view the balance of power in North America, hit that like button, share it with someone who needs a reality check, and make sure you're subscribed to the channel. Keep questioning the narrative, look beyond the political theater, and never underestimate the silent players on the global stage. I'll see you in the next one.